In 2005, I created a piece called Broken Chords, which was a direct result really of my divorce that was happening at the time, and the shock and the grief and the loss that entailed for me emotionally, and a sort of humiliation actually that happened with that, because both of us operated in the same field of contemporary practice, and it took a very long time for the news to filter down that what had been celebrated a couple of years before was now undone. So moving forward from Punch Drunk, the cast for Broken Chords were TC, who was by then an artistic associate of the company because we'd worked together for many years, the three Poles, Aurora, Patrizia and Janusz, and then I asked 4 other performers to join the company. So this was actually the largest ensemble that I'd worked with Vincent Dance Theatre in 2005. I'd met Alex Katona, who's a brilliant cellist and musician and performer, at Rui Horta's lab space in Montemoro Novo in Portugal the year before, on a residency there, and been blown away by his skill and his sort of approach really. So I invited Alex to join us as a musician slash composer slash performer, and that was the beginning of a long collaboration with him. I invited Lee Claydon, who is a fantastic contemporary dancer who's really strong and can throw pretty much anything and everyone around. Ellie Dowling, who's a flamenco dancer who I'd met at Welsh Independent Dance the year before, making a piece there. And she's a flamenco dancer as well as a contemporary dancer, which is quite an unusual mix. And finally, Darren Anderson, who's an Australian, actually he's now British, I think, or allowed to stay here. But at the time, he had not been over from Australia, from Bundaberg, Australia, for very long. And I can't remember where I met Darren, but he had a real vulnerability about him and a real sort of I'll give anything a go, almost puppy-like eagerness to please, which of course became his character in the show, because I ruthlessly exploit people's natural states, I suppose, to make a piece of work. So that was the 8 performers, big ensemble. And because I was in the process of divorcing my previous set designer, I designed the work myself, which was a big risk, because I designed the early work, but I hadn't designed anything for about 5 or 6 years. And it took me a while, but as usual, I set a context of many, many chairs in an empty space with a chandelier hanging overhead. And I knew when we started working on the piece that the chairs would be as choreographed as the people, as the cast. And so the piece begins with what looks or can be read as a chapel or a school or a quite a formal setting. And then as the piece unravels, which it does, emotionally and physically, the chairs become more chaotic. So they go from order to chaos, and that's the conceptual arc of Broken Chords. The other sort of conceptual, starting point is that I wanted there to be a beautiful, almost romantic piece of work that was a response to my marriage falling apart. I didn't want to make an angry piece, but I did want to find beauty in the chaos, I suppose. And so, having set an intention not to be angry, what happened was I created a beautiful piece that reflected on love and loss and grief and finding a new direction in my life to the one that I thought I was going to go in. But because that can be very self-indulgent and very emotive, and working with Polish people, we all like to emote quite a lot, I decided to cut into that with these other things that spiked that romantic vision and didn't allow it to become self-indulgent. So there's 2 pieces in one, basically, Broken Chords. There's the piece that wants to be made, which is almost like a eulogy or written on a gravestone, almost like an elegy to loss. And then there's the humorous chaos that happens when the performers don't follow through that vision. And then there's also within Broken Chords, and this was happening in real life as well, I suppose, off the stage, a kind of rebellion from the performers about why is the director asking us to get so involved in her personal life. So there's actually a place in the work where TC stops the show and says the director's been having a few problems, which in a contemporary dance piece is very unusual, I found, that to break the fiction. So it was quite complex dramaturgically. There's the fiction of this beautiful piece, there's the performers kind of not quite agreeing to it and disrupting it and being quite mutinous, if that's, causing mutiny. And then there's a point where one of the performers comes out completely and directly addresses the audience and says, almost excuses the self-indulgence of the whole work. And audiences loved it. As with making Punch Drunk, I wanted to exploit each individual performer's skill, and beyond the beauty and the visuality and some stonking partnering group pieces, Ellie did a whole flamenco thing on some chairs, and I asked Patricia to learn a 9-minute Passacaglia from Bieber, which again, because she has never wanted to be a classical violinist really, she took that as a real challenge to play without music for 9 minutes, a very complex double chorded piece of work. And in a way, this was a piece where I combined Bach and Bieber and John Avery's music and Alex and Patricia's string music on the violin and the cello, and also TC's then husband Colin Elliott made a few pieces of music for the work as well that were very orchestral arrangements. So 3 composers and Patricia on the violin contributing to the music for making Broken Chords was a very difficult mix to manage, but ended up with a soundtrack to the piece that was very beautiful and very varied, but somehow all hung together in the same forlorn, melancholic, grief-stricken arena. And actually TC and Colin had been in the tsunami the year before we made Broken Chords, and so as artists, both of them were, and as people, they were still processing that, and so I think they brought that difficulty to the work as well, sort of the challenges of trauma really. And that sort of inherent, that fighting against what's happened, which I was doing and they were doing in a different way, I think also fed the piece hugely. But it sounds like a very dark piece, which it is, but it's also very beautiful, and it's actually very funny because I send myself up in it, and as I said before, the director gets a bit of a hard time. And interestingly, 2 years later, because this piece ran for a long time, I ended up playing the role that TC had created with me, and that was extraordinary really, to talk about the director when I am the director performing the piece. I suppose a running theme in Broken Chords, in Caravan of Lies, in Punch Drunk is, but mostly in Broken Chords, is how the show must go on in your head, even though you feel like stopping everything. And when you have a big shock to the system, you want to stop in a way, but you also want to process that shock through artistic means, or I do anyway. So as an artist who minds my emotional experiences of life to make work, Broken Chords became in a way a vehicle for doing that. And I don't think it was an indulgent piece at all in the end, because I think by then I was crafting, I had developed a compositional skill and kept an eye on the humour and kept an eye on how great the collaborations the contributions from the collaborators were and what they offered into the space, that I think it's just a solid piece of work, and it actually toured for 4 or 5 years, and it went to Germany and it went to America, it went all over the place. It was an unusual piece. And one person that helped me craft it was Ruth Benthoven, who worked as a dramaturg on the piece, and that's now an ongoing 10 years on is an ongoing relationship. And she really helped me work out the narrative threads and the strands compositionally that made up this piece, and helped the performers to really clarify what their roles were when they were in the action and out of the action. And that sort of being on stage but off, and being on and being on off and being off is something that we've worked a lot with since making Broken Chords. This sense of self-consciousness that you're performing, or that you're going into an abstracted version of yourself through dance, or that you're shifting from a direct address to a fictional state, or that you're somehow using different languages, some of which are very literal and naturalistic, and some of which are movement-based and abstracted. And so we were looking at form and structure really closely in the making of this show, and the whole piece really is about form, structure, and how you develop the artifice of performance to say something, but you step in and out of the fiction, in this case, to point very clearly that someone's making you do this, and that's the director. So there's multiple layers of sort of postmodern theatre within Broken Chords, of breaking down the fiction, breaking down the fourth wall. And the reason I used Bach and Bieber in the work is because they lift the dance into what's proper dance, with proper music. And then the other stuff is, as I said before, cutting into it and undermining the properness of the dance. Because I work with proper dancers, they actually can pull that out the bag. And because I work with proper musicians, they can pull that out the bag as well. So the other thing that we took forward from this is a sort of casual approach to our skills, that you can do a throwaway virtuosic performance, but you might then step out of it and kind of go, so what? And that's something that I'm interested in, is constantly undermining the showing off of skill, which a lot of dance does, is quite vain actually. And what we're more interested in, I suppose, is a more self-deprecating questioning of, we have these skills, but are they useful? Are they saying what we want to say? And if they're not, we can be more casual in our use of them. Broken Chords was a hugely successful production. And again, it was an interesting time, because the ensemble felt big and solid. The work felt like it had survived losing a set designer that I'd worked with for a long time. I knew, sometimes when you're making something that it's functioning really well, and that it's hitting the mark in terms of humour or bleakness or beauty or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So I feel like I really achieved what I set out to achieve with Broken Chords, the title of which obviously is talking about chords being broken. And one of the chords that also started to break within that process was TC's extraction from being a really sort of integrated part of the company. And looking back now, I think we'd probably both agree that was, working relationships often come to an end after 10 years of working together. But also she was processing her trauma from being in the tsunami, and I was processing my trauma from getting divorced. So that was quite a difficult mix, I think. And she came back over the next few years to help sort of co-direct a children's piece that we made, and got involved in a short piece of work, which was a digital installation. But really, Broken Chords marks the end of TC and my major collaboration. And also because it took so much to make that piece of work, and because it toured for so long, I actually had a break from making large ensemble pieces for maybe 2 or 3 years afterwards, until I made If We Go On in 2009. So actually 4 years later, I made smaller pieces, I think, that felt more manageable after making such a piece that required every muscle in my body, every bone in my body, every emotional teardrop was invested into making Broken Chords. And I think it showed, but I couldn't do it again for a few years. And I don't think TC could either.